Hello, and you are listening to news on RainierAvenueRadio.World. I'm TC, and today is Wednesday, January 30th. The news on Rainier Avenue Radio is live every Wednesday from 6:30 to 7 p.m., providing you with current, trustworthy news content focused on super service to the local South Seattle audience. We will not tell you what to think, but instead provide the basics for you to discern and decide for yourself. In local news, the Seattle Officer of Labor Standards recovers more than $120,000 in minimum wage violations for Seattle home care providers. In a statement released on January 25th, the Seattle Office of Labor Standards announced a $120,000 settlement with Acres Washington LLC, a company that provides supportive living services to people with developmental disabilities. The Officer of Labor Standards, or OLS, investigation found that Acres failed to pay the correct minimum wage for 377 employees who worked or attended trainings in Seattle throughout 2017. Sterling Harders, president of the labor union SEIU 775, said, quote, "Thousands of SEIU 775 caregivers working in Seattle care for individuals with developmental disabilities in home care and supported living. Our union works closely with employees and advocates to ensure that caregivers are treated with dignity and respect. Yet, in some cases, caregivers, like other workers, aren't treated fairly and aren't paid what they are owed." End quote. Acres recently announced that it was closing its King County operations after the Washington State Department of Social and Health Services cited them for serious deficiencies in care standards. Their sister company, SL Start and Associates, was also shut down for violations of care standards. A child and a man killed in Everett crash have been identified. Everett police continue to investigate a one-car crash on Sunday morning that killed a 5-year-old girl and a 25-year-old man. The Snohomish County Medical Examiner's Office identified the deceased Tuesday as Isabel Torres, 5, of Everett, and Elmahu A. Dirge, 25, of Linwood. Both were in the back seat of a car, and at the time of the crash, according to a statement from Everett Police Department, a woman was also in the car, as well as a man who was driving, and both are expected to survive, police said. The car was traveling east in the 1100 block of 1112th Street Southeast around 9:15 a.m. Sunday, when the driver lost control while passing through an intersection at Evergreen Way. According to the police, the car struck a tree and power pole, breaking the car into two pieces. Witnesses told the car was moving at a high speed. Witnesses found the girl in the back seat of the vehicle and performed CPR, according to Everett Police. The woman was found in the front passenger seat with serious injuries, and the two men were found lying in the roadway, one dead and the other seriously injured. The injured passengers were taken to local hospitals where the girl later died. Detectives believe speed was a factor in the crash and are investigating whether drugs or alcohol were involved. According to Everett Police Department spokesperson Aaron Snell, said it won't be determined whether anyone involved will face criminal charges until the investigation is complete. Seattle's preschool program gets silver medal. In a report released last week by Rutgers University National Institute for Early Education Research, NIER, Seattle's preschool program beat out all 39 other large U.S. cities assessed for their program quality. However, Seattle, only a silver medal in the report, which was also co-written by the nonprofit policy advocacy group City Health, a joint initiative of the Foundation and Kaiser Permanente. The reason for this is that the program enrolls fewer than 30% of the city's total 4-year-old population. Gigi Weisnerfield, a co-author of the report and assistant research professor with NIER and Rutgers, explained in an interview that more than 30% cannot be enrolled in preschool because there weren't enough paid slots available for them to attend the program.
The Seattle preschool program leading, and it's great news. So we know if Seattle keeps up the incredible job it is doing with the quality policies and the enrollment increases with the increased funding, that number will shift to probably greater than 30%, which would then shift the program into a gold status.
Over to you, Kendra.
Thanks, TC. Measles cases in Washington state. Last week, King County confirmed that a local man in his 50s contracted measles, a highly contagious but preventable disease. The man was hospitalized but has since recovered. However, it's not clear where the man's infection was acquired, as he traveled to multiple locations around Puget Sound recently. Health officials are also concerned with this case's connection to a larger measles outbreak in Clark County, Washington. Public Health Communications Director James Appa sent a link detailing the outbreak investigation in Clark County, which includes 24 cases of children under the age of 10 contracting measles. King County Public Health Office Dr. Jeffrey Duchin explained in an on-the-phone interview how you can protect your community from measles.
Important thing you can do to protect yourself and your community, your family, your coworkers, and others in our area from measles is to be up to date on your vaccinations. For children, they should be vaccinated at 1 year of age and again at 4 to 5 years of age. All adults should receive at least 1 dose of measles vaccine, and certain adults should receive 2. If you travel internationally or if you're a healthcare worker, 2 vaccinations are recommended.
In other news, CEOs of Seattle's area's biggest companies advocate for more housing for the middle class. A group made of CEOs of 17 local employers is advocating for policy changes to create more housing aimed at the middle class. But outside of Microsoft, they have yet to invest any of their financial resources into the problem. The CEOs of King County's largest businesses, from Amazon and Boeing to Starbucks and Nordstrom, are pushing for more housing for middle-income workers at a time when professionals like nurses, teachers, and cops are increasingly being priced out and new housing is aimed mostly at higher earners. Challenge Seattle, a group of 17 local CEOs led by former Governor Christy Gregoire, released a report Wednesday that amounts to a call for action on more housing aimed at households, making between $54,000 and $108,000 or less for individuals. The group also includes the chief executives of Microsoft, Costco, Zillow, Weyerhaeuser, Alaska Airlines, Expedia, and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, among others. Except for Microsoft, the companies thus far have not contributed their own financial resources to spur investment in new housing. Instead, they are advocating for things Gregoire concedes should prove challenging to implement, like zoning reform and changes to real estate investment that could lower profits. The basic problem is this. Over the past decade, local home prices and rents have soared twice as fast as incomes. The biggest impact has been on low-income residents, but now about 40% of middle-income earners spend more on housing than they can afford, defined as more than 30% of their income. The group asks local governments to relax zoning laws to allow for more density, especially near transit. That will be a tough sell in suburbs where housing construction is already weaker than its historical average, as residents fed up over issues like traffic and noise fight to protect single-family neighborhoods. However, mayors of 9 local suburbs, at the urging of Challenge Seattle and Microsoft, recently signed a letter committing to consider such changes. The CEOs also asked governments to reduce impact fees that help fund projects to offset some of the issues development exacerbates, like traffic, to reduce construction costs. It wants the state to relax laws that make it easier for condo owners to sue developers in the hopes that the change will spur more condo construction, an effort already underway in Olympia this session. And it wants tax credits used to finance low-income projects to be extended to projects aimed at middle-income earners. Microsoft, a member of the coalition, made a big splash earlier this month with plans for a $500 million housing fund, including $225 million in loans to help finance middle-income housing at below-market interest rates. But no other member of the group has committed to spending its own money on the problem, even as the housing crisis affects their employees and communities where they are based. The report acknowledges an obvious self-serving aspect of their efforts. The housing crisis makes it harder for companies to attract and retain employees, and the region risks losing its economic edge because of affordability problems. This is the news on RainierAvenueRadio.World. We will be back with national news after this short break. back to RainierAvenueRadio.World. Last Friday night, the U.S. government shutdown ended at 35 days, but the possibility remains that it could start up again. According to the New York Times, President Trump agreed to reopen the federal government for 3 weeks, while negotiations continued on how to secure the nation's southwestern border, backing down after a month-long standoff failed to force Democrats to give him billions of dollars for his long-promised wall. President Trump signed a stopgap spending bill that would restore normal operations in a series of federal agencies until February 15th, and open the way to paying the 800,000 federal workers who have been furloughed and forced to work without pay for 35 days. However, many federal contractors, unlike government employees, are not expected to get back pay for their checks because they work for a third-party company that government pays for its services. A report released Monday by the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office found that the economy took an $11 billion hit, including $3 billion that will never be recovered. If the Democrats and Republicans don't come to an agreement by February 15th, another shutdown may begin. The Joshua trees destroyed in National Park during shutdown may take centuries to regrow. Whether or not another government shutdown will continue after February 15th, the effects of what transpired in the last month will perhaps be felt for hundreds of years at Joshua Tree National Park. The Southern California park, famed for its dramatic rock formations and the spiky leaf Joshua trees from which it takes its name, only had a limited number of workers during the shutdown. As such, with most of its park rangers furloughed, vandals and inconsiderate guests did things such as toppling gates and posts and carve new roads through the desert. Furthermore, some of the Joshua trees, which are estimated to be 1,000 years old, were outright destroyed. According to the New York Times, pictures posted to social media showed trees that were chopped down or that appeared to have been driven over by cars. John Loratig, a former park ranger who now runs Friends of Joshua Tree, said that the most park rangers were behaved, but, quote, "It was just a few vandals or people acting out of ignorance that caused these problems. Hopefully, it's not malice. Maybe they just didn't see them," unquote. A volunteer cleanup crew consisting of about 100 people cleaned bathrooms and repaired broken gates and fences, but Mr. Loratig says that it will likely take hundreds of years for the newly planted Joshua trees to grow and mature. For U.S.-China trade talks, hopes are high, expectations low. U.S. and Chinese negotiators start 2 days of high-level talks Wednesday at settling a 6-month trade war that has weakened both sides, shaken financial markets, and clouded the outlook for the global economy. Yet the odds seem stacked against any substantive resolution this week to the standoff between the world's 2 biggest economies. Perhaps the best that might be hoped for, analysts say, is that the 2 sides agree to keep talking. Earlier negotiations flamed out, and this time, President Donald Trump might be inclined to drive an especially hard bargain after being forced to cave into a dispute with congressional Democrats that partially shut the federal government down for 35 days. Moreover, a new complication injected itself into the U.S.-China relations on the eve of talks when the Justice Department brought criminal charges against the Chinese tech giant Huawei, accusing it of stealing technology secrets and violating sanctions against Iran. Beijing shot back by demanding the Trump administration pull back from what it called an, quote, unreasonable crackdown, end quote, on the Chinese maker of smartphones and telecom gear. The core of U.S. allegations against China is that Beijing systematically steals trade secrets, forces foreign companies to hand over technology as the price of access to the Chinese market, and subsidizes its own tech companies. A deadline looms. On March 2nd, the Trump administration is scheduled to escalate its tariffs of $200 billion worth of Chinese imports from 10% to 25%. But compelling China to reform its trade policies and treatment of foreign companies will be difficult. And when the administration imposed tariffs on $250 billion in Chinese imports, Beijing retaliated with import taxes of $110 billion in U.S. goods. President Donald Trump has threatened to extend tariffs to an additional $267 billion in Chinese goods. If he did, President Trump's import taxes would cover virtually everything China ships to the United States. Over to you, Natalie.
Thanks, Kendra. Parts of the Midwest are colder than Antarctica during the deep freeze. The deadly deep freeze enveloping the Midwest sent temperatures plunging Wednesday to rival some of the most frigid spots in the world, triggering widespread closures of schools and businesses and the canceling of more than 1,600 flights to and from Chicago's airports. The U.S. Postal Service even took the rare step of suspending mail delivery across much of the region. Hundreds of public schools and universities from North Dakota to Pennsylvania canceled classes as residents huddled inside amid one of the coldest air masses in years. The bitter cold is the result of a split in the polar vortex that allowed temperatures to drop much farther south than normal. That meant temperatures in parts of the Midwest were lower Wednesday than in Antarctica, according to the National Weather Service. In Chicago, temperatures were still dropping after plunging early Wednesday to minus 19 degrees, breaking the day's previous record low set in 1966, and colder than weather in Barrow, Alaska, the most northern town in the U.S. And that doesn't include wind chill, which in northern Illinois made the air feel as cold as negative 57 degrees. The National Weather Service warns that a wind chill of minus 25 can freeze skin within 15 minutes. Officials throughout the region were focused on protecting vulnerable people from the cold, including homeless, seniors, and those living in substandard housing. Some buses were turned into mobile warming shelters to help the homeless in Chicago. Quote, "These conditions are actually a public health risk and you need to treat it appropriately," end quote. Chicago Mayor Rahm Emanuel said on Tuesday, "There are life-threatening conditions and temperatures." The U.S. Postal Service has suspended mail delivery in parts or all of several Midwest states, including North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Iowa, Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, and Ohio. Governors in Illinois, Wisconsin, and Michigan declared emergencies as the worst of the cold threatened on Wednesday. In Chicago, major attractions closed because of the bitter cold, including the Lincoln Park Zoo, the Art Institute, and the Field Museum. In Michigan, homeless shelters in Lansing were becoming overloaded, Mayor Andy Skor said. They also were filling up in Detroit. At least 6 deaths have been linked so far to the weather system, including 2 people in the Detroit area, according to local police. Other deaths included a man struck and killed by a snowplow in the Chicago area, a young couple whose SUV struck another on a snowy road in northern Indiana, and a Milwaukee man found frozen to death in a garage. In other news, Trump administration begins Remain in Mexico policy, sending asylum seekers back. Implementing a new hardline immigration policy by sending a single asylum seeker from Central America back to Tijuana, Mexico, to await his assigned court date later this year in San Diego. The first asylum seeker to be returned to Mexico was a Honduran man identified as Carlos Catarlo Gomez. He appeared confused and scared by the throng of reporters waiting for him Tuesday on the Mexican side of the San Isidro border crossing, according to the San Diego Union Tribune. He was whisked away by Mexican authorities. Officially dubbed, quote, migrant protection protocols, end quote, the policy was announced by Homeland Security Secretary Christian Nielsen last December. Administration officials initially called it a, quote, remain in Mexico, end quote, policy to deter the waves of asylum-seeking families fleeing mainly the Northern Triangle nations of Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. Until now, asylum seekers were allowed to remain in the U.S. pending their immigration court appearances. There's a backlog of 800,000 cases piled up in U.S. immigration courts. The number of migrants detained at the border is near its lowest level in decades, even as the number of asylum seekers has doubled since 2015. The new policy does not apply to unaccompanied minors or to asylum seekers from Mexico, according to government documents. We will be back after a short break with global news. This is the news on RainierAvenueRadio.World.
Welcome back to RainierAvenueRadio.World. More than 100 migrants feared dead after raft sinks in rough, icy Mediterranean Sea. The new year has barely begun, but it's already been deadly for migrants trying to cross the Mediterranean Sea to Europe. On Friday, a raft reportedly carrying 120 migrants, many from West Africa, sank in the rough, wintry sea. The Italian Navy spotted bodies floating near 3 survivors, 2 Sudanese and a Gambian, who were being treated for severe hypothermia and trauma at a hospital on the Italian island of Lampedusa. On Saturday, the 3 men told the staff from the International Organization for Migration's Italy office that the group set off from Libya, which is now the main departure point for migrants trying to cross to Europe by sea. The survivors said their raft left the Libyan coastal city of Qasr Garagbuli, Libya, on Thursday night and began to deflate after an estimated 10 hours at sea. The migrants hailed from countries including Sudan, Cameroon, Nigeria, and Sierra Leone. Most were adult men, but there were also 10 women, including one who was pregnant, and 2 small children, including a 2-month-old infant. Quote, unfortunately, all of them are missing. The Italian authorities have now called off rescue efforts. It is very, very unlikely that we would find survivors at this point, said Flavio De Giacomo, an IOM spokesman. This stretch of sea, known to migration scholars as the Central Mediterranean route, is long and deadly. Quote, tragedies like this are unfortunately typical, De Giacomo says. The vessels are absolutely unfit to be at sea. After a few hours, they start to deflate. People panic and move to one side or the other and end up in the water. Many don't know how to swim, unquote. Yet still risk, even after Italy struck a deal with Libyan authorities to turn back rafts and return migrants to Libya, where many are abused and even enslaved. Another route, the agency from Turkey to Greece, was largely closed off in 2016 after a deal between the European Union and Turkey made it harder to cross and claim asylum. The deal came after 1 million asylum seekers entered the EU in 2015, angry nationalists throughout Europe who have whipped up xenophobia to win votes. The UN's refugee agency says another boat with 53 people aboard recently disappeared in Alboran Sea in the Western Mediterranean. One survivor, who was at sea for 24 hours, is being treated in Morocco. In all, some 200 people have drowned in the first 3 weeks of 2019, De Giacomo said. The rafts sink in the open sea as if they're visible, he says, disappearing everyone on board without a trace. Back to you, Natalie.
Thanks, Kendra. In other news, Venezuelans take to the streets in a walkout to push Maduro out. Protesters in Venezuela gathered on the streets of Venezuela's capital Wednesday, waving their nation's flag and demanding Nicolas Maduro step down from power in a walkout organized by the nation's reinvigorated opposition. Protesters said they were heeding the opposition's call for another mass demonstration, despite the heavy-handed response by security forces over the last week to quell anti-government protests. The latest walkout comes 1 week exactly after opposition leader Juan Guaido proclaimed himself the nation's rightful president amid a sea of supporters, hurling the nation into a new chapter of political turmoil as the anti-Maduro government tries to establish a transitional government and the socialist leader tries to cling to power. The 35-year-old lawmaker has transformed from a little-known opposition figure into a commanding force in the nation with the backing of U.S. President Donald Trump and 24 other nations recognizing him as Venezuela's interim president. The turmoil has morphed into a larger geopolitical standoff as Maduro accuses the U.S. of orchestrating a coup by backing Guaido and enacting punishing oil sanctions while powerful Venezuelan allies, China and Russia, continue to stand by the president. Maduro has been overseeing military training exercises broadcast on state television on a near-daily basis over the past week in an apparent attempt to show he is still the backing of the armed forces, whose support is key to either man's claim to the presidency. The already distressed nation is likely to face even tougher times ahead after the U.S. imposed sanctions Monday on Venezuela's state-owned oil company, potentially depriving the Maduro government of $11 billion in export revenues over the next year. After this very short break, we'll be right back with you with sports on RainierAvenueRadio.World.
Cool. Welcome back to the news on RainierAvenueRadio.World and now in sports. Roger Goodell breaks silence on controversial no-call in NFC Championship game. After failing to publicly address one of the biggest officiating failures in the history of his tenure as NFL commissioner, Roger Goodell finally spoke Wednesday about the controversial no-call in the NFC Championship that arguably denied the New Orleans Saints a trip to Super Bowl 53. His response? These things happen and the NFL has to simply do better. Quote, we understand the frustration of the fans, end quote. Goodell told the media after making remarks about the upcoming Atlanta Super Bowl. Quote, I've been talking to Coach Sean, the team, the players, and we understand the frustration that they feel right now. We certainly want to address that. Whenever officiating is part of any kind of discussion post-game, it's never a good outcome for us. We know that. Our clubs know that. Our officials know that. But we also know our officials are human. We also know they are officiating a game that moves very quickly and have to make snap decisions under difficult circumstances. And they are not always going to get it right all the time, end quote. Goodall wasn't specific on how the officiating problems would be addressed beyond explaining the mistakes were recognized, and the league feels it has to be accountable. Now that is all for sports and everything like that. So we're just going to have a little break. Back to you, Kendra.
Thanks, Stacey. Do you guys want to spend the weekend with us? This Saturday, February 2nd, Rainier Avenue Radio presents an exclusive NW film screening, the award-winning film Questions. After the screening, stick around for the discussion with a very kid Waddell. $10 suggested donation at the door, and it starts at 6 p.m. Come on down. Then on Sunday, February 3rd, we are hosting the Super Bowl 53 party, which will be hosted by Seahawks legend Edwin Bailey and friends. Come on down to the festivities to catch them in person, or tune in to the pre-game broadcast that starts at 3 p.m. along with our festivities. This is the news on RainierAvenueRadio.World. Thanks for joining, and we'll see you next week.